birthday cake I saw last night. Pardon? Did you have Mickey Mouse birthday cake last night? I saw a photo of it.
Oh, you know what? That was from Austin.
Oh, okay.
It was a Mickey Mouse cake.
I almost did on it, put a comment. I held back.
That wasn't ours. That was just, I liked the picture.
Gordon, nice choice in the birthday cake.
Yeah.
Yeah, how fun that you were there that day.
That's right.
My husband and I
I don't know that they have
Oh, really?
done that. So, yeah, that would be fun. But it's not on the agenda.
Yeah.
It's, yeah, but it's not on the agenda, but that's okay. All right, thank you very much. We are going to hear a discussion item at this time, an assessment update, and there are several areas that I think the board wanted to have some information and clarification, and perhaps just questions. One is the CTB settlement and contract information. Another might be the RFP and the timeline and the process for that. And it's my understanding that DOA is with us today to talk about the procurement process so that you have a little bit more information. All right, Michelle Walker.
Thank you.
Director of
Thank you,
Assessment.
Superintendent Ritz. Good morning again, everyone. Just wanted to share a few things that are happening this week. Excited because we have lots of educators with us this week reviewing new items for our English Language Arts and Mathematics assessment for Spring 15. And they're actually just across the way over at the Hyatt. If you have time when you finish today, you're more than welcome. We would love to have you visit. And certainly it goes through Friday, so if you're in town and you want to stop by, you're more than welcome. So they are reviewing lots and lots of items, all the different new item types that we've been talking about. So we're excited, they're excited about the new standards as well as the assessments. So we've got a great group, great chemistry. The second thing I wanted to talk about real briefly is that we are redesigning Acuity, and you might have heard about that, but I just wanted to make sure you were aware that we are replacing the 3 through 8 ELA and Math Acuity predictive and diagnostic assessments with what we're calling Acuity readiness assessments. And they are based on our new standards for ELA and Math in grades 3 through 8. So we're excited about that. We've done what we call open access, where any school who didn't yet sign up to use Acuity in the spring for this coming school year, but would like to use these new assessments, can actually sign up to use them. And that window to sign up is open until August 20th. It's called Open Access. Information has gone out to test coordinators, and it'll also go out in the DOE dialogue next Monday just to be sure that superintendents and principals are
And
up
the
to speed.
timeline for that is as usual, correct?
Yes, and there will be 3 forms, so there are 3 windows, 3 readiness windows. The first one actually opens September 29th. That gives folks a chance to start teaching the standards and then to assess how students are doing and inform their instruction. Also, the blueprint for these Acuity readiness assessments is the exact blueprint of ISTEP. So the teachers that I've been talking with about this week who are with us are really excited because they're anxious to monitor student progress on our new standards. So wanted to give you that update as well. Another thing I wanted to talk about before I introduce our CTB guests is the professional development that we have coming. And I know I've spoken with you about it, especially during the assessment subcommittee meeting, but I did want to just revisit for the entire board that we are doing PD in September around assessment. The first portion is around open-ended items. What will it look like for students to actually provide evidence in their writing, in their math open-ended items? And the second portion, of course, is on those technology-enhanced items. And our Experience College and Career Ready Assessment will open on October 1st. And you might remember that's a sample test where teachers will have an answer key and they can use it as an instructional activity. In fact, that's the training we're actually providing, is so that students and the teacher both interact together with these new new technology-enhanced items. We want to make sure we're not measuring how well they can drag and drop next spring. We really want to measure how well they've learned our new standards in ELA and math. So we're excited about that. We're gearing up for those. The second main topic I have today is going to be a presentation by CTB, and in just a moment I'll introduce Ellen Haley. She's the president of CTB, and she and her team have information to share with you. I know you're interested in knowing more about the Spring 15 test design, so we're excited to share that with you today. And then last but certainly not least, we do have two guests from the Department of Administration with us today, and they wanted to share with you the procurement timeline that is managed by the Department of Administration, and so we wanted to share that with you today. So without further ado, oh, I'm sorry.
I have a quick question, Madam Chair.
Yes,
If
go
I may
ahead.
be recognized. We just saw this settlement agreement that I guess was signed in October. Can you give the members of the board and
Sure.
the public a overview of that settlement agreement before CTV speaks to us?
Sure, I'd be glad to.
Thank you.
It's interesting because when we've been talking with the State Budget Agency and the Attorney General's office about the agreement, apparently we should have just amended the contract to add those pieces. It really isn't considered an agreement, but that's probably outside of my realm because I'm not an attorney. But I am glad to share with you some of the information and some of the pieces that we are actually working on right now that are part of the agreement, if you will. So you might remember this agreement was when we had some interruptions with testing, online testing. Oh, good. Oh, my attorney is here to help me. Thank you, Mike. So the agreement was between both the department and CTB with regard to what products and services would we actually agree upon as part of the settlement. And so one of those things, for example, was the development of piloted items that we're going to be giving in Science and Social Studies in the spring of 15. So the development of those items during the 2013-14 school year. And actually at the end of July, we had a group of teachers in, and I think I told you about that last month, who reviewed those items. So part of the agreement was paying for the development of all of those items, which will be delivered this spring for field testing and piloting for future forms for Science and Social Studies. Another component, for example, is what we call the, not growth, what's the word I want to use? Group matrix report. And that was something that Superintendent Ritz had asked for early on when we were talking with CTB. What we wanted to do was be able to share with a teacher the students that he or she has taught for the year, how their I-STEP performance looks compared to their previous year. So it's really not growth, but it is kind of in a way to help the teacher see. So for example, if a student was at pass the previous year, but now the student is at pass plus, they would see that. And it's not for accountability, it's really just a courtesy report for teachers to give that teacher a perspective of his or her class and how well the students performed. For example, on the Spring 13 assessment, we started, as part of our agreement, we actually rolled this out last year. And we're doing it again now. It's actually set to go out in just a few weeks. It is tied directly to the teacher. So one of the things we do is we work with our IT staff on something that's called the DOE EE collection, just to make sure that we match the teacher to the students. And the school corporation actually has an opportunity to verify that match before we run this report. And then the report, again, is no stakes attached. It's a courtesy report for the teacher so that he or she can see how well students performed from one year to the next, really looking at how the teacher has improved that student's performance in English language arts and mathematics. Another component of the agreement is in-kind services with regard to a dollar portion, and that actually was $1.542 million. And so that is part of the contract that we're actually entering into now for our Spring 15 administration. So that's an in-kind, if you will. It's actually reduced from the cost of the contract as part of the agreement. Another portion of the agreement is something that CTB actually does across the country, and they offer to do this with Indiana schools. I did talk about this actually at the assessment subcommittee meeting, and that's where we have an art project. Those of you who might have already visited the CTB Scoring Center have seen lots of student art. There's an artist in residence that actually goes out to schools each year, in a different state each year, and works with students on an art project. And then those art pieces are actually sold at the National Assessment Conference, and the money goes back to the school. So the school benefits in many ways, through the arts, through the dollars that come back to that school, and really recognition that the students receive for their art project. That's just kind of an icing on the cake, if you will, with regard to the agreement, because that's really not something that we asked for. It's something that they selected Indiana as a courtesy as part of our agreement. And so one of the things we'll be doing after Labor Day is actually selecting the schools that will work with the artist. So that'll be a great experience for students as well.
So,
I'm sorry,
so
go ahead.
essentially, but the settlement agreement provides for them to essentially provide a credit to the state of Indiana
Right.
as a penalty for the disruption, correct?
Yeah, so one of the, so there were multiple things, and I hope I've outlined those clearly enough, but for example, the monies that went toward the development of science and social studies, those needed to be spent in 13-14, and then the next set of monies would be 14-15, which is what we're doing with the 1.542 million. So yes, it ends up being a credit for the state, so it's products and services that we receive in exchange.
And the amendment provides, though, for an increase of payments to CTB, correct? Or an increase in the budget? Can you, I think there was a reference to 29 million additional dollars in
So,
increase. Can you explain that for
well,
me?
sure. I'll have to go back a little bit and give you some history on this, a quick history lesson. So originally when HEA 1427 was passed, as well as the state Senate 91, Senate Enrolled Act 91, those two pieces of legislation, as you well know, required us to give ISTEP for one more year. The 91 actually required it through the biennium in terms of a budget through the 15 school year. So originally, our original intent, as we started in January of this calendar year with CTB negotiating what our contract would look like as an extension, because we knew we needed to extend one more year, deliver a college and career readiness assessment to comply with the federal requirement. So originally, you might remember us talking about having a CCRTA, the College and Career Ready Transition Assessment, as well as ISTEP. So at that point, we worked with the Department of Administration on what's called a special procurement, because our contract was going to expire at the end of June, and so then we would need to actually extend that contract beyond the contract length, so we needed permission to do that.
So may I ask you a question? Superintendent Ritz, did you know all this before you signed the contract on June 30th?
Know all what? What is it you're asking me if I knew?
Well, did you re-sign a contract on June 30th to have ISTEP as is? And then the Department of Administration rejected that contract? Is that how it went?
No.
So let me see if I can try to interject and answer that real quick, then I'll go back to
Right.
Mr. Henry's
I have
question.
a couple more questions.
Sure.
Thank you.
I guess I'm confused.
Sure. So this is actually last month is my 8th year at the department, and one of the things that has always been made very clear to me is never let a contract expire if you're going to extend it. So it was suggested to us, and it was actually told to us, to extend the contract the way it is, and then amend it to address what we don't need to do in spring 15,
Was that
i.e.
signed
the
on
old.
June 30th then?
Probably, because we got permission in April from the DOA, and then worked in May on the contract agreement documents. Started it through the process in May, and by the time it actually arrived on the superintendent's desk for signature, it probably was near the end of June. We had to make sure it was signed before June 30th.
So the budget agency then sent it back.
Right, because we actually had learned in the meantime, which I know this is a little hard to follow, that we could actually give our new college and career ready standards, because at the time that we entered into the agreement to start the process of the contract in January, we didn't have new standards. So we were kind of in a catch-22 there, and you probably remember our process of developing standards, which you actually approved on April 28th. Once the new standards were approved, we could move forward with designing how to de-scope the ISTEP as is. We wouldn't need it any longer. Now we had new standards, but we couldn't let the contract expire. So we pushed forward through the documents, but worked with the state budget agency to say, we're actually going to amend this because we need to move forward with our new college and career ready assessment.
We knew all along we were going to have to
Yes.
make amendments to our
Yes,
contract.
definitely.
And went through the actual process for that
Right.
to happen. So we'd been in contact, and June 3rd, when we learned that we needed to give an operational assessment, you know, we actually were in more dialogue about what that
Right.
was going to look like for 14, 15,
Right.
and what needed to be amended. So we've had contact the entire time about amendments that were going to be needed to the contract.
Yeah, it
So
was
we were just
kind of an
following
awkward timeline, to be honest
procedure,
with
correct.
you, yes. Mhm.
So has the contract, the copy that I have is not fully executed, is it?
If you have the as-is portion, that was what we submitted just to be sure we met the 30th deadline of June. But the one that actually we received permission yesterday for special procurement, because the contract did expire, because the state budget agency said, no, that's okay, let it expire, apply for another special procurement, which we did, and received permission this week to go ahead and enter those documents into the contract system. So those are only for ISTEP Plus, ELA and math for our new standards, and science and social studies.
Okay, but as of today, we don't have a fully executed binding
Right,
agreement
because-
with CTP, correct?
Right, we have a good faith agreement with them because we actually had to go back through DOA for another special procurement.
Okay.
Sarah?
I just had a question regarding the settlement terms as well. I thought I had recalled from an earlier conversation when we were first talking about the development of the assessment for this year, that we had been told that we already had enough existing pilot items. Yet one of the elements of the settlement agreement is the development of pilot items. So I was just curious where that discrepancy
Sure.
came from and what the need was for that to be a part of the settlement.
So, and I think you're talking about science and social studies.
Okay.
Because
Yes.
Okay, because we obviously weren't going to pilot additional old standards, but for ELA and math. One of the things we wanted to do was kind of get ourselves set to be able to actually administer the science and social studies for the next 2 to 3 years.
Okay.
And part of our agreement was that they would develop enough items to carry us that far, so that we actually could put our main focus on developing new items aligned to our new college and career ready standards.
So we will own those items?
Yes, we own all of the items,
Okay.
including those that we'll actually use this coming spring.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
great question.
my only other question, which I know we had discussed as part of the assessment subcommittee also, but I just, and I don't want to speak for the board also, but when we're looking at the scope of students that were affected by the interruptions that precipitated this agreement in the first place, and then we're looking at the art project, which albeit is a very cool program, and I love it, and I wish we had the ability to bring that to students across the entire state. I don't know how I rationalize to my constituents that this small group of schools has access to this program and that should make them feel their needs have been met with the interruption that took place. So I guess I'm just looking for, number one, a little more background on how the schools will be chosen that get that, and how that's considered to be a fair settlement agreement.
So I guess I use the term icing on the cake. The art project isn't really part of the financial agreement. It's something that they put a price tag on it so that we would know how much it actually costs CTB to implement that. But they selected Indiana as part of their good faith effort to make things right. So it really isn't part of a financial agreement. It's really more about, we're selecting Indiana as our next state where we will work with kids and sell their art, which will actually generate some dollars for those schools. So I think that's a fair question that you have, and I'm glad you asked. But I just wanted to try to clarify, it's really not the dollars so much as it is the opportunity for students.
Do you have some suggestions?
Yeah.
We haven't
We're
really
getting ready
engaged in
September to
conversation
select
about
them.
selecting
Yeah.
schools.
I would love to work through it with the department or
That would be great.
possibly have some ideas, but I would like to be able to fully explain
Sure.
to students, it affected students across the state.
Right.
So I would like to see it not be a localized benefit to few.
Well, we actually will work on that right after Labor Day, so we would love to
Okay.
have you help.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yes, Brad?
So I want to make sure I'm clear. The settle agreement that was sent to the board just recently that's dated October, is it settled or has it been rejected? What is its status?
It's an amendment.
It actually, yeah, it was approved by the Attorney General's office
Before
quite
you
some time
signed it
ago.
or after? Did you get the Attorney General and Governor to approve it before you
The
signed it?
Attorney General,
Did you sign it before
we
they approved
hired,
it?
let me go back.
Mhm.
We actually hired somebody from the Attorney General's office to be part of this process, to make sure that we were doing this appropriately and making
Right.
sure that we were going to be entering into this settlement agreement. But it's really an amendment to the existing contract that we have with CTB. And it had services for 2013-14, and it has
Right.
services for 14-15. So that's how we
It's
worked
not-
through it, and that's
I'll
all
let
there is
Brad-
to it.
I'll ask my questions later.
Yeah, I think the word agreement has kind of been misleading. You know, the Attorney General said, really, it's not an agreement, it's an amendment, but
Yeah, Brad?
I guess my question is more just of how the department and the board works together and how we can work better. It really bothers me. You know, we come here and then I have to listen to frustration over the fact we bring a resolution and we're trying to put some guardrails in place just so everybody knows what expectations are. I agreed, along with some of the other board members who serve on an assessment subcommittee. I don't remember talking about any of this. I don't remember talking about it in a public board meeting. My understanding of the statute is that board has to be involved in authorizing a contract, so it seemed to me like it would be reasonable that it would be, those things would be discussed. We come in and we set test windows. It's a big deal to our constituents. I just got calls this week from people who wanted to let me know how many days are going to be dedicated to some kind of a test. And many of those districts are up to numbers like 25 or 35 days of testing for different various tests. So the assessment is a huge deal right now because it's driving a culture within our schools that's moving us away from innovation and creativity towards this compliance mindset of trying to constantly get ready for a test. And I know it's a concern to you because I know we've talked about that. It's a concern to us, but I don't know how we work well together on that when we get these surprise ahas. I'm stunned. I mean, I got to be honest with you. I'm sitting there, I was staring at that settlement agreement or amendment or whatever it was and looking at this date, realizing all the conversations that have transpired where we could have had this dialogue and it's never occurred on something as critically important as this. And I guess I'm at a loss. I'm asking, I mean, I'm not asking to put you on the spot. I'm asking, how do we get through whatever this is, this us versus them, whatever it is? How do we work together? Because I think our kids benefit better in this state when the policy setting body is working collaboratively with the policy enforcement body and the right hand and the left hand know what each other are doing. And when I raised that in the past, the response I get is, well, you should go ask your board staff. Well, that's an unacceptable answer. I mean, there should be collegiality in such a way that it shouldn't be necessary. I would hope at this level, I mean, we're at the highest level of educational governance in our system, that we ought to be able to sit down at a table and look at each other and have an honest dialogue about what's going on. That settlement agreement, I've had people question it because there were people who were aware of when that contract was issued that there's language supposedly in the contract that offers options on how that could have been settled with disruptions. There could have been financial penalties that the Indiana could enforce. And I don't know. I'm not an attorney.
Yeah,
Maybe the
and
department
there
has
were.
the absolute legal right to decide how to settle it. But you know what saddens me in all that? That set aside is the fact that we haven't even had so much as an update. And here we are, and it's August, talking about something that was signed last October that affects our kids. I'm not even sure. I'm afraid to even go out and comment. I get questions from school superintendents right now saying, hey, is it one test or are we having 2 tests next year? And I thought you all said that we were going to go, it was just going to be 1 test. It was going to be a modified I-STEP test. But now we're getting communication that it's an I-STEP test plus college and career ready questions. I got people that are concerned that the test questions aren't going to be really aligned to CCR standards. All that is symptomatic of the fact that there's not good communication. And I'm just simply pleading. I'm willing to come if I don't know what I can do to help this, but as one member of this board, rather than stay in this pattern of finding out after the fact and bringing out stacks of stuff to make a big deal, can we just talk to each other and just say, hey, this is coming up, we need to be aware of it, and how do we best serve kids together?
Madam Superintendent?
Brad, I do want to say that this document that you have is an amendment with a contract that we don't even have totally finished yet. They're linked. It's an amendment to it, to the 2014-15. So yes, whereby we were working through things for the issues that took place in that school year. And we did get only the amount that was in the contract that I had nothing to do with. We did get that amount credited to, was it like $400,000? What, do you remember the amount?
I think it's 358,000.
Right, that was
the
credited
liquidated
back
damages
to
in the
us. That's
contract
all
were
that was
actually
in the
applied.
actual contract for disruptions. So this was done to get this going, and we involved the AG's office, and we are working through the contract piece, and this is attached to the 2014-15 school year, has always been meant to be attached to the 2014-15 school year contract.
I would
The
just,
damages are
If-
2
if-
to 3 million actually in
if-
total.
if I could just say one last thing to that.
I think it was 3 million
Yeah, it's
something
3
total
million
in
something. I don't have
damages.
it.
Because the
Right.
comment was made just a minute ago by the superintendent about how the conversations have been ongoing with CTB, McGraw-Hill, and I understand that. I mean, that's a reasonable expectation. The department is going to be engaged in conversations. All I'm saying is that if you're already engaged in that level of conversation, there is a role for the board to play. The other Dr. Walker, who's waiting to speak, last time we were together, very clearly pointed out how explicit the statute is under which the state board operates, that we're responsible statutorily for compliance issues, including make sure that things are compliant, including in contracts. I don't know how we do that when we're finding out about things after the fact. And this feels much like the waiver in that respect, that it's like an aha, like, wait a minute, why didn't we hear about this sooner? And we need to, I'm saying that not to be hypercritical, but to say we got to change that conversation, because there are dedicated men and women sitting around this table that really do want to try and help the situation, help our teachers and students. And frankly, I'm getting tired of leaving meetings and hearing people create their own perception of what this board's about. It's not true. And I'm tired of dealing in fantasy. I want to deal in reality. Reality is I want to help kids, but I can't help kids if we're not having an honest conversation here.
I just had a follow-up question. So I have just a couple more questions, I promise.
Okay.
Number one, what was the criteria that you all used at the Department of Education to arrive at a penalty credit
Sure.
of $1.5 million?
It's actually a little over 3 million, but it's actually written into the liquidated damages portion of our contract. So it talks about if a system goes down for a certain period, for the first day it's this much, or for subsequent days, and I don't have it memorized, so I'm sorry, I can't repeat it back to you, but we actually do use that formula to assess liquidated damages, and then we work with the vendor, whomever that is, to determine what is the best really agreement or arrangement, if you will, to benefit the state in terms of dollars. Is it in-kind services, which actually is the development of items we need, is actually pushing forth the design of the new test? What were things that we actually knew we would need to purchase, to purchase and use those dollars for that amount? Actually, I think you heard me mention that 1.542 is just kind of an off-the-top being deducted from what we will owe for the 14-15 school year.
Right, but how did you develop that number? Like, how are we sitting here today to know whether that's good for the taxpayers, good for
Sure.
the public, or is bad, or it's average, or?
Sure. I think probably I would need to, and I'd be glad to do this, share with you more what the language is in the liquidated damages section of the contract. It actually dictates how much money it is per day, and if it's more than a few days, then how much is it? Like if it's $25,000, for example, for the first day, but after the third day, it's $50,000 a day or whatever. I mean, we could share that with you.
Okay.
I'm sorry I don't have it right here with me, but that's actually what's used to determine the total amount. And then the vendor and the department actually sit down and determine what is it that we actually are going to put into the next piece of our work that we need to pay for. So how much of that can we go ahead and pay for with these dollars?
So, and I am attorney, so I can say this. To me, it is a settlement agreement. It's a final resolution of all claims that the state may have against CTB. So, we are, in exchange for those liquidated damages, we are giving up any future rights that we might have against CTB. So I just wanted to make that point. Legally, you can put it in an amendment, you can have a settlement agreement, but I think it's a little unfair to characterize it as a simple amendment to a contract. It is truly a settlement agreement of legal claims that the state of Indiana has against one of its vendors. And I would like to call on our board attorney to give us staff's perspective of the current status of this contract and advise us to, where it is in the process. So Attorney General, sign off, et cetera.
Michelle, do you know the answer to that question, though, first off, where it is in the process? Go ahead. Why don't you go ahead, and then I'll call Michelle. Michelle and Michelle.
I'm happy, yeah, let's hear from both of them. Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no kidding. So I think you're asking about the 2014-15 contract, just to make sure.
Mhm.
And so that is the one that we had to go back through procurement to say, can we have permission to enter into this agreement, because our contract did expire on June 30th. And so, because originally we were just going to amend the contract that we had, is the as-is that you asked about, to be able to say, yes, we've extended it before it expired, and the state budget agency said, that's okay, let it expire, go ahead and ask for another special procurement, and then push forward your contract documents. So we're ready to enter those, and yesterday we did get confirmation when we were at DOA, yes, you can go ahead and do that. So they're ready to go, and we've actually been implementing, with CTV's help, many of the things that are in there, for example, the content review.
Okay.
Question?
Michelle, hold on, Tony, just 1 second. One quick question for Michelle, since I asked her to talk. Is that your understanding of the current status, and do you have anything else to add?
Sure. So as Dr. Walker described, the contract, just because we're talking about lots of contracts and I myself get confused, the contract that was submitted on June 30th that included the 2 separate assessments has died. And now we are in the process of trying to get into place a final contract for the 14-15 administration.
Mm-hmm.
That contract originally had the settlement agreement that we're talking about as an exhibit, but as we have been sort of discussing, it has some various, what I would say described to be legal flaws, and so that cannot be an attachment. We will need to basically take some of the substantive content and then just make those the content, build those into the 14-15 contract rather than having this settlement agreement, because settlement agreements do need to be signed. It's under state law by both the office of the Attorney General as well as the governor. So in addition to that, there are just some other little concerns here. Specifically, like all settlement agreements, has a dispute resolution clause that doesn't comply with state law, and other things. So the new 14-15 contract, this will not be a formal exhibit as one of the submissions included. That will have to be built in to the contract itself to address the in-kind services that are described herein, and then of course fulfill the 1-year extension that was described. It sounds like the special procurement has been approved, and then we will see the 14-15 contract move through expeditiously, hopefully, since the school year has begun.
Question?
Oh, yes, Brad, sorry.
Did the original contract require authorization of the state board legally for us to enter into the original agreement? I mean, could DOE have just gone out and shopped and got a provider to provide ISTEP? Did it take the authorization of the state board to enter into that agreement?
So, I mean, the statute's pretty clear that the state board authorizes the development of the ISTEP program. So it necessarily involves an act of authorization, overall authorization. And I think we've had conversation before about how do we interpret that authorization and what that looks like. And there's some flexibility around that, and I think it's sort of up to the board to specify how particular the board wants to be in terms of authorization. So it can be sort of a carte blanche grant of please go do an Indiana statewide assessment program, or it can have the board as an entity can have more of a role in specific authorization.
And I guess where I was going with that is whether or not the board needs to authorize any amendment or sign off on any settlement. I just think from the standpoint, when we talk about transparency, because that comes up a lot here these days, I think in the interest of that, I don't know why we wouldn't discuss those things, because these are the things I can't answer back to my own constituents and teachers and other people going, why don't you folks know what's going on down there? I don't have an answer for that, because I'm finding out after the fact, and I don't know what to do about that. So I'd love to have some legal clarity around that, but I know Dr. Walker wants to weigh in. And
Superintendent Ritz, I think
To-
Tony's
to-
trying to get our attention.
I know. Tony?
Thank you. Michelle, it sounds like the proper parties are not signatory to this settlement agreement. Therefore, I think it is highly questionable as to whether or not it's legally binding. What are our options if in fact this is not legally binding? I for one, had always advocated when we had the issue that there should be a reimbursement of funds for the failures of CDB on the test. What are our options in terms of opening this back up if in fact the proper parties have not signed off?
So I think that that's largely a question for the Attorney General's office. I will say that my conversations, and I feel comfortable to say that they had said that this settlement agreement as written would not be approved by their office. So we might be getting mixed messages, but I was told very specifically that this as written would not be acceptable, and that was, again, part of the reason that it would not be an appropriate exhibit to a formal contract. I think that ultimately the ability to reopen or look through this again, with obviously CTB being a good partner, would be a matter that the Attorney General's office they would need to weigh in on that.
So Michelle, if I hear you correctly, the department hired somebody from the Attorney General's office to actually oversee this entire settlement process, and now you're indicating that it's not appropriate.
Sure.
That
So,
it wasn't done correctly, because that's the sole purpose in which we hired somebody from the Attorney General's office.
So what I'm saying is Indiana Code, now I hope I don't transpose my numbers. I think it's 42611, very specifically, it might be 46211. I think it's 42611.
We can look that up later.
Specifically provides that any act by the state that basically releases the rights of the state needs to be approved by the Attorney General's office as well as the governor. And not Attorney General's office, but the Attorney General himself and the governor. So obviously we can see the signatory lines on the 4th page don't include those signatures. And then I mentioned there are just a couple of little flaws that perhaps that, for example, the dispute resolution language. All state government lawyers we've become far too familiar with the boilerplate procedures, and that the American Arbitration Association, for example, is not how we do dispute resolution. So there are some flaws that I would say, what I would describe to be legal flaws to the document as a settlement. When you look at whereas clause 4, it says IDOE and CTB desire to amicably and mutually compromise and fully settle finally and completely all claims, allegations, and assertions which may now or hereafter exist. Continuation, final and complete settlement of all controversies and disputes between them. It's pretty clearly a legal settlement release, and because it doesn't meet those other requirements, I would say that it has legal flaws. And again, I think that it's pretty clear under statute that those pieces need to be met. So for those reasons, as I described, it would not be able to be a formal exhibit to a contract. And the substance of this, our understanding has been that moving forward, we just need to build substance in to address these for a 14-15 contract.
And I'm sure the department will be working to get that accomplished. Thank you very much.
Superintendent?
David?
I have two questions, one for Michelle and one for the superintendent. Superintendent said a couple of times that you hired someone from the Attorney General's office. I'm trying to understand, is this a salaried employee from the AG's office that you hired? In
No,
addition,
no,
can you just?
we acquired their services to actually help us through this entire process of this settlement.
So was this person is part of the AG office, but you hired him or her? I'm trying to understand that concept.
Yes.
So did this person receive an additional salary?
But
From the
what's your
department?
arrangement with the attorney?
Michael?
It was done through an MOU, which is not really uncommon. Some state departments do hire, if you will, an attorney from the AG's office to help with pre-litigation or litigation stage. So it was through an MOU, so he wasn't paid in addition to a salary.
Is that a conflict of interest of any kind?
No.
No.
Okay.
No, the rules of ethics do allow state government attorneys only to represent multiple agencies even when there's a conflict.
Okay, thank you. Michelle, my question is for you. You indicated there was some ambiguity in the board's role in this, and that ambiguity allowed the department to go forward with this potential contract. And I'm just trying to solve an issue. I'm very concerned that this was entered into in October, and we're finding out in August in something that I know Brad chaired a committee on assessment, and a number of my colleagues worked very hard on that. And it does affect every child in every school in Indiana. I think there needs to be some oversight of some kind, and I think we're the oversight policy-making body. So my question is there a need for a resolution to come before this board just to clarify that ambiguity so that the department and the board don't get into this misunderstanding in the future? Is that what you will recommend? Or how do we solve this so there's no indecision or ambiguity?
Sure. So I want to be clear. I was not trying to suggest that there was ambiguity. In particular, I mean, for the agreement, I do think that there were pretty specific requests in the month preceding when the agreement was signed for the board to get updates about the agreement. So I think that it was specific, and I think that the fluidity or in the statute under 2032 was addressed by the board. I don't think that the statute is ambiguous. I think that the statute gives the board flexibility around how specific it wants to be in what it authorizes. And that's why I say if the board as an entity specifies, we would like to take X role, we would like to see the settlement agreement, or we would like to have a role with that, then that would be specific. Or if the board says, we would like to hire consultants around assessment, as we've done, I'm just trying to use examples of things that have occurred, then, or make recommendations, or whatever the final assessment system needs to align with the guidance of CCSSO, that's a pretty benign recommendation, but the board could do things like that where you're specifying what your authorization looks like. So I don't think it's ambiguous. I think that the statute gives the board very precise and broad responsibility in terms of the authorization. In fact, at the back end of the statute, I can't remember the subsection, I think it's 7, it says that the board has an obligation and duty to ensure the reliability and validity of it. So I think the board has very specific, broad responsibilities when it comes to authorization of the statewide assessment system, but how the board handles that is somewhat fluid, and the board just needs to be clear about what specifically it is expecting to take in terms of that role.
And that was the gist of my comment. It was the board's authority, not the statutory ambiguity. And so I would recommend that we move forward with a resolution for next meeting that would lay out what the board's authority is and what we would want it to be. And if staff were to put forth a resolution, I'd be very happy to work prior to the meeting to lay out a resolution. Anyone else can join us. Just to lay out what the board sees as its authority. For example, should it come to the board for a vote prior to being signed? And there may be some other things on there, and that's what you're saying is that there's no clean understanding of what it should be, and it to be transparent and to not mislead anyone. We should just lay that out for everyone, what our role would be given the statutory authority.
And so, just a quick comment. What has been the authority and how it's operated, I haven't done anything different, nor has the department in its role with contracts and pieces that has not been done by every superintendent prior to me. So what you're suggesting is that you're wanting to change how that all operates in the state of Indiana.
No, what I'm suggesting is that we have a discussion as a board on what that should be. And I'm thinking it may start with a resolution, so we have at least an initial draft to move forward some discussion. I would want it to be an action item on our next agenda in case after the discussion, we do want to make a motion and adopt it or not adopt it. But it seems like time is of the essence here, and we need to move forward to make it clear what we want as a board.
And I guess I just want to be sure that everybody understands that we're moving forward with our department's responsibilities with this contract with CTB, and we're going to move forward with that. So I don't know what the resolution is supposed to do regarding that, but I will firmly be talking with my legal counsel regarding the department's role in how all this works too. So there's going to be quite a bit of dialogue, I guess, as a result of this conversation as we move forward.
And if I may, just about all of this, I would recommend just, especially given where we are for 14-15, I would certainly recommend that anything not apply to 14-15. I feel very behind the 8 ball in terms of a state with not having that contract in place, and even the same for 15-16. We have folks here from IDOA to talk about the timeline, and we're already really pushing things with the timeline. It would be certainly my preference for us to be further along. So anything that we would want to do, I would certainly want to make sure that we're not undermining the ability to be efficient and proceed swiftly, because we preferably would be further than we are with both of those matters.
Brad?
Just a final comment, because I do understand that the general public and teachers and everybody else, when they hear these very detailed legal discussions at the board, they get frustrated because it goes on ad nauseum. But I think this is the point that before we leave this, I think needs to be understood by everybody. And that is, if we really want to help our students, which I think we all do, it is really hard to help them when you have one conversation going on that involves board members about what's the pathway forward on assessment, and there's conversations clearly going on away from the board that have legal implications to them that take options off the table, potentially take options off the table, or changes the dynamics. And all I'm simply saying is this. This is not, we start talking about resolutions and stuff, this is not an attempt by the board to tell the department how they should do their work. It is a request to say, educational governance works best when there's ongoing dialogue and transparency, so that we understand fully where we've been, where we are right now, and how those things impact where we need to get to. Because at the end of the day, I would hope everybody around here would agree that what we really want to have happen is have the best possible assessment we can to know with certainty what our students know and can do. And it's just extremely frustrating. This is the same, almost exactly the same concern I've tried to express, and maybe I've not done a good job of that with the whole waiver. It isn't that the board wants to write the waiver, it's that the board has responsibilities that get impacted if decisions are already being made or the groundwork is being laid that commits the state of Indiana to a direction without appropriate dialogue. And so when we talk about a resolution, the only thing the resolution does is just resolve as a board. It's the only way to express ourselves, to say, this is where we think we should be heading. It's not trying to tell anybody how to do anything. And so I just put that out there because to leave this discussion, I know we need to move on. I really don't want to go back, read in a newspaper, or hear some other Twitter feed about how the board was beating up on the department and telling them how to do things. I want to help kids, but we can't do that unless there's honest dialogue going on between the board and its responsibility to set policy and direction and the department who's doing the very challenging work of carrying that out.
Superintendent?
Yes, Dan?
Just for your reference, I worked with 3 superintendents, and frankly, assessment is so important. When we talked about the concepts, we didn't negotiate the individual bits and pieces of content. Yes, we did. We paid a lot of attention to assessment because it is very important to teachers and superintendents and students and their parents. So yeah, we did, and we were informed. And I just for the record too, this was a settlement, right?
Yes.
Okay. Because earlier I thought there was some disagreement, was it a settlement or it wasn't.
It's a settlement that was to
Okay.
be amended to the contract.
And the other thing that's a little disconcerting, and I just have to bring it up in public, what's the art project work and what does it have to do with this? What's the price tag on the art project and what does it have to do with the settlement?
Michelle, you want to reiterate that again?
I mean,
Sure, so
I'm a little flabbergasted.
I think, I want to say it's 150,000 or 110,000, something in that range.
So
But
it's
it's
part of the
actually, the dollars are actually not part of the settlement. The amount that is worth is listed there, but as I tried to explain a little bit earlier, every year CTB picks a different state, and so they did select Indiana.
Who decided on this being part of the settlement conversation?
Because we wanted to add it into our contract, I think that's why they put it there, that we wanted
So
to say
you
that we were going to
initiated a
be
discussion
selected.
about art
They
project?
offered us as the next state, and so in order to,
I just
document
had to ask
that.
you, try to get it clear in my mind. I was having a hard time.
It's good
Sure.
timing, though.
Well, it is good timing. yeah.
I don't know if maybe we want to, I guess I need to ask Mike to just explain what the Attorney General's office told us, just so that people will be clear, and then we can move forward, I think, to our next.
Sure, and have CTB actually speak because I know they've got a time
Yeah, I
commitment.
know I want to hear from CTV, but if I can pose a question to the superintendent, just, you can answer it now or after he's done, but just, I want some clarity on, since the school year has already started, what is the go-forward schedule and plan for getting this contract signed, sealed, delivered, approved?
I think Michelle just addressed that. I think both of them just did.
So yesterday, we got approval for the special procurement. I'm sorry, I sound like a broken record. So today, we're entering those documents into the contract management system, and the state budget agency had indicated they would help us fast track it. I think Michelle even talked about how we're trying to expedite it so that it can move forward as quickly as possible.
Great.
Thank you.
Mike, go ahead and address
Sure.
the
And
AG's
actually, to
office.
finish up Michelle's thought, the 2 attorney generals we met with last week also offered to help during the drafting process of this final contract. So they'll be approving it kind of ad hoc or on the fly and helping us draft it and make sure that it's going to be able to pass the requirements. So we met with the attorney general and a representative from the state budget agency last week, and the attorney from the attorney general who actually we hired to help negotiate the terms of the settlement agreement or the agreement, explained that, and at the other attorney as well, that it's not uncommon for pre-litigation for certain departments. At the 3 levels they described, there's litigation, there's sort of pre-litigation, there's sort of something's wrong, we want to resolve it right now. And that's where they explained that's where we were at the time. We were discussing some sort of arrangement with CTV to resolve the issue. The biggest issue would be the IT problems that CTV was experiencing. So they did not have a problem with the department resolving it, since the funds were at the department. The department was obligated to implement, monitor, and overall function of the test. In negotiating that, in fact, the attorney general who helped us with the settlement said that we got a better deal than Oklahoma, and they thought was a good resolution for the state of Indiana, including the requirement that CTB conduct stress tests of their system and all school systems before the implementation of the test this year. And if you remember, Oklahoma had the same problems they had last year. We did not. And so the attorney from the Attorney General expressed that was a good deal. And it was forward thinking to do that ahead of time. So what was the specific question I was supposed to answer? I forgot, I'm sorry. Regarding what?
I think you did.
Okay.
I think you did.
Thank you.
All right, CTB, you want to introduce Ellen?
Sure. I think Ms. Neal had a question.
Oh, sorry, Andrea.
I'll pass.
Okay. So the second of my three items is actually to have CTB share with you. I know you've been interested in knowing more about what the test design looks like for Spring 15. So I've invited Ellen Haley to share her staff, to introduce her staff who are here. And they have a short slide presentation. They do have copies for you. They'll distribute those now to give you an idea of what the test design will look like. It is, again, just one test, but with 2 windows. And the assessment subcommittee was really helpful in helping to kind of rename those into part 1 and part 2. And that's part of the slide presentation as well. And then I'll say a few words about the RFP, and then that'll be the end of my part. Thanks.
Okay, good morning. I think
Good
it's still
morning.
morning.
Good morning.
I'm Ellen Haley, and I'm president of CTB. And I think you asked us here to talk about the test design for the spring 2015 test. And given that I am president, though, I can't probably say nothing about the previous discussion. It sounds like it's an internal discussion between the board and the department. From our point of view, we've worked with the state for many, many, many years, and we entered into that, what I do consider a settlement agreement, almost 9 months ago or longer. And we're operating in good faith under that agreement, and we intend to do everything we said in there, which is more than was required in the contract, significantly more. And if there's any further discussion, obviously there'll be attorneys involved, but it's unfortunate to hear this after all the good work we've done together. I'll just say that personally. So turning attention to spring 2015, I have someone going to switch the slides for me. As I said, I'm Ellen Haley. I'm president of CTB, and I have with me today 2 of our vice presidents, Dr. Craig Mills. He's the vice president for research and measurement and statistics for CTB, and Sally Valenzuela. She's our vice president for content development, and we're each going to take a piece of this short presentation, which is now moving around on the
Thank
Sorry,
you.
we're just trying to get so we can see it.
We want to be able
Could we go to the next slide? Between us all, we have many, many years of experience. Craig and Sally are nationally known, have strong reputations in the measurement and testing industry for excellence, and highly regarded in our industry. So I'm pleased that they're part of our team, and they'll be able to give you more information than I am going to. But we are going to talk about the test design and why it's been selected. It's underway right now, and the item development that will support that design to assure you that you have a strong test, as you've had in the past springs, for 2015 for accountability purposes. And then we'd be happy to take any questions, but maybe we get through the whole thing and then we'll happy to take
Yeah, that would be
questions.
helpful. Why don't
Okay.
you go through your whole presentation, and
Yes.
then we'll save our
And
questions.
I'm mindful of time, so we'll go
Thank you.
faster than maybe we thought. Just quickly, some key points that I'll make here. With the new assessment in spring of 15 will be completely aligned to your new Indiana academic standards that you approved in April. You will own all the items. They will be newly created. We're writing them now. They're being reviewed, actually, many of them now, over at the Hyatt all week long in content reviews and sensitivity and bias review sessions. We recognize that the standards are new and the tests will be new, and so we're working with the department on a sample test that will be available this fall so that teachers and students can see what the test questions will look like. There will be no fall field test. We're not going to have 2 administrations. You'll just have the 1 administration in the spring of 15. It will be called an operational field test, and Craig will describe to you why that's a legitimate and appropriate model, given the fact that you've just changed your standards. You don't want any connection to the old I-STEP. You don't want any of the old items. You want to own all the items. They all need to be new, but you need a test that you can use for federal accountability purposes. So we have all of those considerations when you select a test design. The test will be ready in time for your 2 testing windows, part 1 and part 2, which my understanding is the same dates as we've had before, March and then the April-May timeframe. I'll make some closing comments at the end, but right now I'm going to turn it over to Craig to talk to you about the different field test operational designs and why we've selected the one that you're going to be using this spring. Okay?
Thank you, Ellen.
Thanks, Ellen. I'd like to echo Ellen's pleasure at being able to talk with you today about your exam. And I'm going to end by talking about what the whole design looks like for next spring. But I wanted to start by talking about field testing, because I know that has been a subject of some discussion here. So the basic tenet that we want to be sure of is that any test question that is included in a student's score is a good test question. And there are a lot of ways we can go about doing that. And so, but they basically, in the entire measurement industry, they fall into three broad categories. One, the first one is an operational test with an embedded field test. So a student takes a test, it has some number of items that we know at the beginning we're going to include in the student's score, and then others that we plan to use in future administrations, and we know in the beginning they will not be scored. So this is used fairly regularly, particularly in ongoing programs. It's efficient. It's probably the least expensive way of doing field testing. You know that the students are motivated on every question because they don't know whether it counts or not, so they need to work on it. But it does require a little bit longer testing time in the administration where you're doing that. So the second is you have two test administrations. You have an operational test administration where all of the items are going to count to the score, and then you have a non-operational where none of the items are going to count to the score. Again, you get information, statistical information about the questions before you put them on a test where you expect them to count. But in this example, which by the way is what you're doing with your book 2 in the applied, it's now part 1, ISTEP Plus part 1. There's a book 2, a separate book, a separate administration, so the students know they're not going to count. And we know that motivation is down, and so you can't trust the statistics quite as much. But again, if you have the ability to do 2 administrations, you want to invest the time of the students, of the administrators, all those sorts of people, that is a very commonly used way of doing field testing. The third is you understand how many questions you want to score for each student. But since you don't have statistical information, you have all your great item review information, the work that's going on over at the Hyatt, for example. But since you don't have the statistical information, you want the flexibility to be able to say, after the administration, I'm going to get the same information I would get with the other field test models, but now I want to evaluate which questions are the ones that I'm going to score. You most recently did this in 2010 with the IMAST test. Prior to that, in 2008, when you moved from fall testing to spring testing, you did a version of this. You had an idea of the quality of the questions, because you had been using them, but when you're moving them to another part of the year, you really don't know what's going to happen. So knowing that you had some concerns, I reached out to some colleagues, and I gave them a hypothetical example. It's similar to the situation you have, but not exactly. So I described a testing program that had new standards, did not have the ability to do a separate field test, but needed to report scores in the spring. And so here on, if you look at that slide 6 in the deck that you have, this is the question I posed to them. I said we would build slightly longer tests than desired, and then select the items to be scored based on the blueprint and the statistics after we have administered the test. And those would be the ones that would count to the student's score. So that's what we asked. Let me tell you a little bit about who we asked. We asked 4 prominent psychometricians. All of them are academics at large public universities, and they have significant experience consulting with operational testing programs. 2 of them are past presidents of the National Council on Measurement in Education. One of them, past president of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. 2 of them have served on multiple state technical advisory committees. And one is a past director, and one is the current director of a nationally known center that does test reviews of the whole range of tests. Now, full disclosure, all of these people have served on technical committees that I have run in the past, either while I was at Educational Testing Service or while I was with the CPAs. So summary of what they said, all of them said it's acceptable practice. All suggested you be very careful in the design of item reviews for content, lack of bias, all of those sorts of things. One of them told me that she has used it with her clients in the past, and it's been successful, and she thinks that it would be successful in this case as well. Another one said that he has seen it used quite frequently in credentialing and licensing exams. And then one of them reminded me that there was a time when there was no field testing. Everything was operationalized field testing. And all the analyses were done after the fact. So in summary, operationalized field testing is a psychometrically sound model, as are the other two. But the model that you're going down will give you a reliable, valid, defensible exam. Okay, so what's that exam going to look like? Let's take. Okay, let's start, if we could, on the right-hand end of this chart. So spring 15, total items administered per student. This is what the student is going to see next spring. Part 1 in March, Part 2 in April and May. So 8 questions in math, 10 in ELA in the Part 1, and then 65 and 64 in Part 2. Now coming one step to the left, 5 of those questions will not be included in the student's score, but will be used to create the vertical scales that you need to have. Okay. Now looking at the next 2, spring operational, spring additional administered. Those are the ones that, in my example, would be administered, scored, evaluated, and then the one under operational is the one that would be selected to be included in the student's score. And the ones on the right would be the ones that we said, okay, maybe there's a couple of them that we don't want to ever use, but they would be available to go into the bank for the 16th test, if, as we expect, they will be very good. So now if you look at the spring 14 operational, spring 15 operational, you'll see that there is only one difference in terms of the items that go into the student's score for next year. And that is the addition of one more question into the part 1 for math at each level. So that's your design. That's an understanding of the operationalized field test. I'd like to let Sally now talk about how we're making sure that all of those questions are going to be.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sally. Several of Craig's expert colleagues mentioned the importance of being sure that the items are aligned, and I think Mr. Oliver, I think you mentioned earlier, people asking about how can we be assured that the items are aligned to the standard. So I love, some of you know I love to talk about content, so I'm going to spend just a minute kind of starting from the very beginning of how we develop items. So we use a process that's called evidence-based design, and so just to put that in kind of plain language, we start looking at the content standard. So we don't write a question over here and then come and say, okay, which academic standard does it meet? We start looking at the specific standard. And then keeping in mind that students' responses to the questions are going to provide evidence for their learning, and that evidence needs to support all of the purposes and inferences that are going to be made about individual students and about groups of students and about schools. All those inferences are going to be made based on the evidence that the test elicits. So we go back to the very beginning of the academic standard, and we say, well, looking at this standard, what kind of response would we need from a student to provide evidence that they know this? So we really almost write the answer before we write the question. And so we look at each standard and we develop what we call sometimes evidence statements. So this is the evidence that our test needs to elicit from students to support the inference that we're going to make about, yes, they understand analyzing a passage to get the main idea and so forth. So we really start with defining that evidence. And so once we've done that, then we can think about, well, what's the best item type? Does this belong in the constructed response section of the test? Can we get it adequately multiple choice? Do we need to use one of the newer item types that leverage some of the capabilities of technology? And then we think about what we call universal design and think, okay, how do we get this evidence in a way that all students taking the assessment have an opportunity to provide this evidence? So we don't want any kind of language barriers or other barriers kind of creep into that evidence statement. So this process of thinking and planning before we actually even write the test question is informed by all of the Indiana-specific documents. Obviously, I've referred to the 2014 Indiana Academic Standards. Those are the standards that we actually start with. We also have a set of item specifications that include these evidence statements or information about the kind of evidence to be elicited, the types of items that are best used to elicit that evidence. All of those are in a set of item specifications that we developed that were actually approved back in May before we started item writing. So we do all that upfront analysis of the standards, specifications about how the items should be written. All of that work gets done before we ever write the first test question. There's an Indiana-specific style guide. When I say style, I mean things like what's bold and what do we underline, and how are the items, is there a stem and context and all of those pieces, so that the format and style of the questions is similar to what students have seen before. So we're going to have all brand new content, but we want the test to be as familiar in style and format to students as we can, given that we're assessing different content. We also have example items, lots of examples of items that measure that college and career readiness rigor, so that item writers can look at those and see kind of what they look like in the context of those specifications. So once the items are written, or once we've identified item writers, we provide a lot of training for them. We basically go over everything that I just described. Obviously, they have some rigorous training and a deep dive into the academic standards themselves based on the grade band they're writing and the content area that they're writing, whether they're math or ELA. We go over the item specifications, how to write, like for example, if the item specifications call for one of the new technology enhanced item types, how do you do that? How do you craft it? What's different? What are the technical requirements for that item type? Go over the style guides so that the item writers are well versed in the process and the informing documents that will define that item development. So we go through the item development process. I wanted to spend a little time defining all of the reviews that are done on the items, because they then go back and support this idea that indeed the items are tightly aligned and do measure those new Indiana academic standards. So CTB does a number of internal reviews. So we'll have an initial review of the item. We review for basically two categories of things. We review for alignment. And so when I say we review for alignment, we look to see that indeed the item measures the standard and that the responses to those items, like the selection for a multiple choice or the written response from that question in a constructed response, actually provides the evidence that would support the inference about whether the student knows that standard. So when we look at alignment, does this item really get at information that supports that standard? And then we also look for technical quality to make sure that there's no linguistic complexity, editorial grammar, all of those kinds of things. If we request revisions, that goes back to the item writer and they make revisions, it comes back, it gets a second review for exactly those same things. We also have an editorial review for technical quality. We look for things there like, again, I've mentioned linguistic complexity several times. Sometimes it's easy to have dependent clauses and different things in an item stem, and our EQA people will give us plainer language that makes it easier for students to actually access the content of that question. And then we have a second senior review by one of our more senior people for that, again, that content and alignment review. When we finished our internal reviews, those items all go to the IDOE, where their content specialists do the same kind of review on every single item. Those items are then reviewed, and then they go to the educator panels. And we've mentioned several times, we've got probably nearly 100 people over there looking by grade band at the math and ELA items that have already been developed for the spring assessment. Do two kind of reviews at the same time. One is the content review, where teachers actually look at the content of the item. They look at the alignment to the standard. We have a whole checklist for them of things that they go through and look at. At the same time, we do a bias and sensitivity review to ensure that nothing has crept in to the item that would convey any kind of bias or sensitive issue that might disadvantage a particular student in responding to that item. That's been fairly standard industry practice for years, and we've all gotten pretty good at focusing strictly on the content standard and making sure that our context doesn't add something that might disadvantage a particular student. The other thing is, as Ellen mentioned, we've worked together with IDOE and others in Indiana for many years in developing items and going through educator reviews. And I just wanted to give you some statistics about the track record, if you will, of the different reviews that are done that support our confidence that the numbers of items in the design that we've proposed for the spring will result in a full set of operational items for students. On the left-hand side, we just included math and ELA in this. These are the acceptance rates at committee. So we bring all these, 1,000 or whatever items over the years to the committee reviews, and essentially all of the items are approved. Now, we have minor revisions to some. There's a few that is like, no, this isn't going to work. Teachers provide context for how the standards are actually implemented in the classroom. So occasionally there's an item that adequately measures the standard, but it's just not in a way that Indiana teachers feel their students would understand based on how those things are instructed. So sometimes there are some items that we do drop out, but 90+% of the items that we bring to committee generally move on into an operational field test or a regular field test. The chart on the right-hand side shows, and this is probably more pertinent to the discussion we're having around the spring test, how many items that have been field tested with students actually work. That's my summary of Craig's analysis. Actually work with kids and move on to some kind of operational use. These statistics mostly represent the constructed response items historically in this applied skill test, because those are replaced every year because of the release. Those are actually the hardest ones because there are so many opportunities for kids to respond in a variety of ways. So that's really looking across the industry, very high field test approval rates in the past assessments. So we're very comfortable that that the items that are being developed and reviewed by us and by the IDOE and by the teachers are going to be successful in the spring. Just to give you some additional context on our own work as CTB, we've actually been engaged over the last couple of years in doing a lot of assessment to various sets of college and career ready standards, which, as yours are a significant step up in terms of rigor, in terms of detail, in terms of the kinds of things that we're asking kids to provide evidence about. So we've done almost 40,000 items in the last 18 to 24 months for both other contracts, the assessment consortia, our own shelf products. So we've had extensive internal experience, probably in this time frame more than anyone else in the industry, writing to these more rigorous college and career ready standards. And we've been able to leverage that experience internally with some of the same people that have been working on this kind of item development in other places to now leverage that experience over to work on the I-STEP assessments right now. So we do have kind of a great deal of experience doing that, and we're really pleased that we're able to leverage that in Indiana as well.
I think we're to the point where you would like discussion or questions?
Yes, I hope, because I don't know how much time we have, but I just hope you see that the model that you've selected, it is an industry-accepted approach, and that the process that we're going to follow, we have a lot of experience with, and the item writing experience we have, and the collaboration with your teachers. I think you can be confident in the spring 2015 test. We'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for CTB? Oh, BJ?
Are we going through the same process with science and social studies, or what will that, like, are they going through questions now as we speak, or is that only math and language arts?
Yeah, I have to ask Michelle, the science and social studies is similar but different in that they're not brand new standards. And I think that review's already happened. I'm gonna let you do that. Sure.
So the Science and Social Studies review was the third week of July. The social studies standards that have been newly adopted were aligned to the items were aligned to those standards. And as Sarah had asked a question about kind of use for the future, we are piloting additional items for science and social studies this spring so we can carry our forms for another couple of years.
So will there be, is that test in the spring of 15 going to look different? And if
No.
so, it will not?
No, it won't have, for example, technology-enhanced items.
Okay.
It will be the same type of items that students have been taking, because we haven't had a dramatic change in our standards. The social studies standards, I
They're
think Bruce did a really great
similar,
job of
yeah.
sharing with you all that they're enhanced over the previous set, but not dramatically different.
So there won't be a social studies, I don't want to call it a pretest, but
So there's
just that
actually a book
exposure
two.
test in the fall.
Right, there will not be. So, well, let me back up and just say that many of you are aware of our experience online testing, which is what we have available on the web for any parent, student, teacher to go out and experience what online testing is like. Right now, or in the past, it had been ELA, Math, Science, and Social Studies. So this fall, it will only be Science and Social Studies.
Okay.
And then the Experience College and Career Ready Assessment is the one that will be ELA and Math. So.
Yes, Brad?
There are
I'm
a lot-
sorry, Carrie, didn't see your hand.
There are a lot of concerns right now about how we bridge and vertical growth and how we're going to look at that. I would like to hear a little bit more about what's going to happen here with this in terms of a vertical scale and how we're going to be able to factor that into work we have to do yet around A to F.
Probably me, then Craig, then Michelle. I mean, you are starting with a brand-new set of standards and a new test, but there are ways that you can still show growth from last year's test to this year's test for all the accountability and other policy decisions you have in the state. And that's a separate contract from ours that Michelle is working on with the center, Brian Gong's center that develops your growth statistics now. But we do want to, in the new test, make sure that a vertical scale is built so that you have really strict longitudinal data going forward. So the design that Craig described, actually I don't think he went into too much detail. At like grade 4, for example, there'll be some 3rd grade items and some 5th grade items that students will take to help build the vertical scale to connect grade 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 so that you can, in 16, 17, 18, get growth information from the test.
I don't want to misquote you, but if I just heard you right, you just got done telling me that the test design company is not involved in the creation of how the vertical scale, that's a separate company.
No, we are involved in development of the vertical scale, but you have another contractor that takes the results from the I-STEP test and uses a growth model to come
Accountability.
up with growth. Michelle, you might have to help me. Come up with your growth statistics. We do that kind of thing, but in Indiana, you've used a separate vendor for that. So we will write the test, we will build the vertical scale, we'll do all the scoring, we'll give you all the statistics, but then you turn all that over to a very respected group that will do further analysis and build your growth statistics. Do you want to add anything to that? Or Michelle?
I think, Dr. Oliver, you're asking a lot more about the, really about the A through F model and the growth for that. And that is actually done separately from our testing vendor. So CTB will build the vertical scale, which will actually be our own, Indiana's vertical scale that we can carry forward into the future. The items we will own from this spring, so we can use those for the future as well. Debbie may want to actually address your questions if you'd like to get more details. Would you like to talk more about the growth? Okay.
Yeah, let's try and limit our conversation to the actual assessment.
Yeah, so you also produce a 3x3 table that tells you if a student was level 1, level 2, level 3 last year, what is their level this year? And so you can see whether they stayed about the same or go forward. That's not really a growth table so much. You could think about it as progress. You might think about it as growth. We think about it a little more like a transition table. How do people do as they move from one grade to the next? And there's going to be a little bit of a challenge with creating those for next year because you're going to have 2014 on I-STEP, 2015 on I-STEP Plus, and the definition of levels will be different for those. However, what we can do is, and I won't go into the statistics, we can make a couple of statistical assumptions, create a concordance table that would say if somebody had this score on I-STEP, they probably would have had about this score on I-STEP Plus. I'm not going to call it linking, I'm not going to call it equating, but it's a concordance table. And if we have that, and then we have their 2015 I-STEP Plus, we can still produce those matrices for the teachers.
I think just for the record, my concern is whether or not that vertical scale will carry forward if we don't stay with CTB 2015,
Yes, it
16
will.
beyond.
Yes, it will.
Okay.
Yeah, vendors change. We don't want that to happen. We hope that doesn't happen. If it does, vendors have experience working with one another to make sure that those statistics and so on transfer.
Carrie?
I just wanted to, because it's a concern, it's a concern of mine, it's a concern that you hear out there, that you said that this operationalized field test will give us valid and reliable data. I mean, I want that to be said so that
I will say it again.
there's no question, because next year when test results come in, there will be people who question it, that I want.
There will. You have used it before. Colorado and Maryland have used it before. I think you've gotten some information about that. I used to run the licensing exam for certified public accountants. We used it there. I used to run the graduate record exam, the subject tests for the graduate record exam, used it there. It's very widely used. The key is what you include in the student's score needs to meet quality standards. And the same analyses that would happen with either of the other two field test designs happen with this design. They just happen after the person takes the test, and that's when you make the decisions of what you're going to score. The resulting scored test for the student, the resulting reported score, would be the same in all three cases.
Andrea?
Yeah, I have several probably very basic questions. Can you explain for me how it is that the 2015 test will give us any longitudinal data at all? It seems to me if we have a new test in 2016, unless you repeat items, that it's essentially you're starting from scratch again. So,
if you could, you would start from scratch. The reality is you need to have some accountability information. So I think at a recent meeting, Derek Briggs gave you some information about how you could do this. There are several things that you could do. One is the student growth percentiles, which I think Indiana has used in the past, but isn't now. Now they're using those 3x3 matrices. What we would do, and this works because Indiana is a large state, we would assume that the 2014 fourth graders and the 2015 fourth graders are equivalent groups. If we make that one assumption, then I can look at a 2015 fourth grade score, tell you what a 2014 fourth grader would have gotten given his or her I-STEP score. So now I have an approximation of last year's score on I-STEP Plus, if we'd had an I-STEP Plus. And now I can look at their fifth grade I-STEP Plus. And I can say, okay, this person moved up, moved down, stayed the same in classification. So that's how we'll do it. We'll make that assumption that from year to year, people at a grade are about the same. And that is consistent with the data that we have from Indiana. You don't see large year-to-year fluctuations at a particular grade level.
So okay, that I guess I still don't.
You'll do better in 16. In 16, you'll have the common items.
Right.
You'll have the vertical
So the
scale.
16 test will replicate items from the 15 test,
Yes.
regardless
I'm
of who the
sorry,
vendor
I
is.
misheard your question.
Regardless of the
Regardless
vendors.
of vendor.
Okay. Now, another question I have involves how different the test items will be in order to align them to Indiana's academic standards versus test items that will be used around the country that are aligned to the Common Core.
So, some differences, where there are differences in, the Indiana academic standards are very similar to the Common Core standards in many ways, particularly in terms of rigor, the problem solving and modeling in math, the text complexity in ELA. Those characteristics are similar of college and career ready standards regardless of where they are. So items that are written to measure those standards will be very similar.
What percentage of items will be different in order to assess what is uniquely Hoosier about our standards?
Yeah, so we'd have to look at the specific crosswalk between your standards and the Common Core standards, and then kind of figure out what that percentage will be. Just based on my familiarity with the standards, it's not going to be a huge percentage, but there will be some small percentage that might be slightly different. We'd have to look at that crosswalk.
And then, will there be identical items that will allow us to do direct comparisons with other states?
I'd like to add just a couple comments before I let Sally continue. So 100% of the items actually will be aligned to Indiana standards. And they actually won't be available for any other state to use because we are going to own those items so that we can carry them forward into 16. I think the things that Sally described, like text complexity, are common to college and career ready standards no matter what. But the items themselves really are only written for Hoosiers standards. And I think maybe that was kind of your key question there. We actually are not bringing in any items that any other state uses. We're developing them from scratch, and our teachers are looking at them this week, and we are not permitting those to be used by any other state.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
David?
just to add, that was part of my point about the design, that we're not taking items that were written to something else and aligning them to Indiana standards. We're starting with the specific Indiana standards and then writing the item.
Yeah, and so my question was just, to what extent are the Indiana standards different from the Common Core standards that your test would be aligned to in other states?
And we could do that crosswalk and give you some information.
Thank
about
you.
that.
David?
Thanks for being here today. Ellen, you're back again. I really appreciate you being here with a few of your vice presidents. It makes a big difference to see you in person and have the ability to talk with you. My question piggybacks a little on what Carrie has to say, or her question about validity, reliability. And it's a highly scientific process that you're going through. It's based on industry standards. Validity, reliability is not even an issue anymore. 10, 20 years ago, if you're that old, it used to be a huge issue, and test bias used to be a huge issue. So I appreciate you running through that with us today. Seems that when the test scores come out, I hardly hear from schools that have high scores about test validity or reliability. Seems those who don't do as well suddenly become engaged with test bias and other kinds of things. And my question deals with transparency. We can't take your presentation this morning and put it on the web, and I'm not sure most people would want to watch it. But what suggestion do you have for us to send parents or school leaders or teachers or others that would provide a layman's way to communicate this information, that it is valid, it is reliable? Does your organization provide a website or commonly asked questions, or how can you help us with that?
I really love that you're going to be having the sample test available in the fall, and that's a piece that could be turned into even more assessment awareness with some text around it for parents to understand. And if there's a way to also show them, here are the standards, don't be really worried about the test question, here are the standards. And at home and at school, the more you can do with your children to bring these alive, they will do fine on the test. But here's what the questions are likely to look like also. So it shouldn't be a big mystery. We have done this in other places, and in Indiana, you've had a parent network from us for a number of years where parents right away see their test scores, and they're given some ideas of things to do at home and during the summer with kids. So there's some precedent for that in the state, and this is a good time with so much new happening for us to work with the department and with you if there's anything that you'd like us to do in that regard. But I love that, all of us as parents or with nieces and nephews or whatever, just this should not be a mystery.
Yeah, I would hope that we would work on it. Parent-friendly materials, community-friendly materials. We have a lot of citizens who are taxpayers who don't have children in school any longer but want to play an active role. And I think we need to do some PR pieces around this, and just to get out the information that it is valid, it is reliable, here's what's going to happen. Here's some sample questions. I'd like to take some of the sample questions to see whether or not I'd pass. I wouldn't give it to you to score, though.
We've done that
I just keep it internally. But
But
those kinds of things, I think it's really important to build momentum, that this is important, that this is a way to gain information to improve what we're doing in schools. It's not a gotcha mentality is how can we make the quality of education better in Indiana? So I would hope we'd work on that, Dr. Walker.
Yeah, the department's already started a dialogue on that.
Super.
Brad?
How much longer is the test going to be? You mentioned it's going to be longer. I can understand why, but that's of concern, of paramount concern to school leaders right now, the loss of instructional time. Do we have a sense of what we're talking about in terms of additional length of time?
So that's a great question. In fact, some of the teachers this week are asking us
Right.
about that
We're getting it.
because they're not focused so much on the number of items, but they're thinking about the new item types, and that it might take longer for a student perhaps to do a technology-enhanced item maybe than a multiple-choice item. And so one of the things we actually do is work with the psychometricians at CTB to evaluate how many minutes do we need to give for each item type, and then certainly give them additional time based on the additional minutes. So we're in the process of establishing those minutes. We generally publish that for the field in December for the spring windows, but that is certainly something that we will extend based on the item types and the number of items. So it's kind of a 1 year giving the.
But we don't know how much.
At this point, we don't, because we're still, we don't know exactly which items we're going to select because teachers are reviewing them. So we certainly can share information with the board as we have updates, though. That would be great.
In the DOE dialogue just this week, we put out just a comparison of changes between 2013-14 and 2014-15 assessment pieces, and there'll be an updating of that containing information. We'll probably have FAQs with questions that come up that we can put out there attached to that as well, so that we can make sure that we're continually putting that out to everyone. I will also say that the DOE dialogue goes to constituents, like the PTA. We engage with the parent groups, and so we'll be doing that as well as we get ready to roll out some very specific parent kinds of pieces. So, other questions? Thank you so much, Ellen, for coming today.
Thank you very much for being interested in this to such detail.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe we have one more piece to address during this assessment discussion, and then we will take a break for lunch.
Okay. So last but certainly not least, and certainly want to thank our DOE colleagues, or DOA colleagues, for being here today. Also wanted to thank the assessment subcommittee personally for providing us with the feedback we needed during our last meeting to really flesh out those components and identify cohorts of students with regard to the new graduation test and some of those other critical pieces. So I'd like to introduce Stan Judson, and he's from the Department of Administration Procurement Division, and he's going to introduce his colleague, and they want to share with you the DOA process of procurement. The department did provide, board staff and the department worked together on the RFP language from our side, from the non-procurement side, the actual content side, and did provide that to them on the 25th of July. So they're doing their part now, and they'd like to share with you the timeline.
Stan may be too shy to tell you, but I won't be. He received it on July 25th at 8:45 p.m., so just a note.
Okay, so what again, yes, as Michelle said, I'm Stan Judson with the Department of Administration. I'm one of the strategic sourcing analysts who works with agencies to develop RFPs and solicitations like this. As you know, the board has come to IDOA to utilize our procurement process, and Tim is correct. What has entailed, I'm sure everyone you know about the RFI that was done, and we've been building the RFP since then. I say we, the subject matter from that has come from DOE and CECI. And yes, we did receive the RFP draft Friday evening, the 25th at 8:45. So our first review of it was last Monday, the 28th. We then held a meeting with CECI and DOE on Tuesday, the 29th, to go over those documents that we had received. From there, we have devoted significant resources to try to expedite this process as quickly as possible, but at the same time, realizing the complexities involved with this. from there, we have developed the timeline that you are looking at now. That timeline is a proposed timeline. It's obviously tentative. That has been built from a few things. We looked at the previous solicitation from when this went out last time. We know from that there were some parts of our normal process that we needed to factor in a more amount of time, such as responding to the questions that will be received. We know last time there were 277 questions received. We expect that there will be as many this time, if not more. There's also the oral presentation section of it. We know that last time that portion of this project took about 5 weeks. Knowing after having received the RFP draft that there are going to be even more components than that, and quite a bit more, we're factoring in more time here. So again, this isn't best case scenario, it's not worst case scenario as far as awarding this RFP. But it's our best guess at a middle of the road timeline that we can expect. Obviously, I know that everyone here was hoping for an earlier time or a sooner time. We were as well. But at the same time, we have to be cognizant of the realities involved with procuring a service such as this. So like I've said, or with all that said, this is our best guess at what timing we would be looking at.
I appreciate having the updated timeline.
You're very
So,
welcome.
and it is an extremely complex RFP with 6 different components, and so I'm sure it will take time.
It is, yeah.
Any questions? Yeah, Carrie?
Because we were handed a handout, we were given a handout, and I don't know that the rest of the people who are here, the people who are watching live streaming are. Could you go over, could you give the
Yep.
final date so that people who
I
are watching
apologize. I
understand?
certainly can.
Because you said it's not October, and I'm sitting here, my stomach hurts because it's March, so, but it would be good for you to announce that.
Yeah, the proposed timeline that we have in here shows an RFP award date of March 15th, 2015. And again, I know there are previous dates that have been thrown around in the past, but quite frankly, there were a couple things that those dates didn't factor in, or did factor in incorrectly. I know at least one of the previous timelines I saw showed the RFP disseminating in June. Obviously, that time has come and passed. So we know we're starting later than at least some parties may have originally planned. Also, now seeing the complexity of the scope of services, we know last time, compared to last time, we have many more components. We know there's 7 overall components, but we also now know that component 6 is being broken down into 8 subcomponents. So for us at IDOA, as far as what we do, we essentially have 14 projects kind of wrapped up into one. For every one of those components, there's multiple sets of paperwork that we will receive for the portion of the project that we evaluate with the Indiana preferences. So, we're not talking about 6 sets of that paperwork now, we're talking about 14. So again, in looking at all of those complexities, that's why we have reworked the timing and done our best to estimate the due date for this as such.
Sarah?
Thank you for your work that went into this, and I appreciate the accurate information on a more realistic timeline based on the information that you have received and the timing with when you received it. I'm not sure who my question needs to go to, but I have some genuine concern about our ability to put out a quality assessment for the 15-16 school year, and I'm curious how this timing of the award impacts the development of our new assessment, and also, do we have information on, I'm thinking from a vendor standpoint, if you're looking at a significantly cut timeline to be able to put the work in to develop the new assessment, are we now in a situation where we are eliminating potential options simply because they don't have the manpower or ability to put a test together for the timeline that we need it to have? So I don't know who that question needs to go to, but I'm concerned that we've now impacted our process and our options simply by what is developed with the timeline here.
Michelle?
Sure, I'd be glad to address that, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I had mentioned, and I think CTB actually talked about it also during their presentation, is that Indiana is going to own the items that we administer in spring of 15. And because we are administering enough items to have both an operational and a field test built in, we would have enough items for another form for the following year, so that we could either have a new form with a vendor, or we could use our own items to develop that form for 15-16. So they would actually have plenty of time to actually build another test.
Do you know, just, and obviously it's different from vendor to vendor and depending on what format we end up taking and the final product, but what is a realistic timeline that it takes from the awarding of an RFP to the actual ability to implement that assessment?
Sure.
How much time is
And
reasonably needed?
And that's a great question. Actually, it depends on whether we would use Model 1, 2, or 3 that Dr. Mills talked about. So if we use an embedded field test, which is actually what we do with, for example, one of the ECAs, where we embed the items, but we use them on a later test in a different year, or a book 2, that takes much longer. That's a good 24 months probably. The operationalized field test can be used multiple times, that concept. So if we were to decide that we wanted an operationalized field test, let's say from whomever our vendor might be for 15-16, even if it is a new vendor, they could still administer the test and have those field test items in there. Again, we're making sure that we actually have enough items to carry us forward if we need to use those same items or the item pool. But I would say, that probably at least I would say 8 months. So if we decide in March who's actually going to build the test, they would have already in their proposal process outlined for us a timeline. And one of the things that we're actually putting in, I hope I can say this is very, very generic in the RFP, is that we are expecting to see how a vendor would actually build a test to deliver in spring of 16. So that we're actually saying that is our goal. We want to hear how you would do it.
Okay. And I guess that's part of my concern, is just not knowing what our test is going to look like. I hope we get a variety of innovative ways that we haven't even wrapped our heads around yet, where they may or may not be using questions that we have in a pool already, depending on what we're looking at. So I want to be cautious that obviously we have what we have, but I want to make sure that we're not excluding anyone from the process.
Yeah, and I think too, because of interoperability of items, the items that we are developing, that our teachers are saying, here's what they should look like, and we're approving these for use on an Indiana test, that's what the items would look like for the future. And that they do have to be interoperable, so they would work on other platforms as well. Okay. So those are some of the details that we actually did include in the RFP language, because we want to ensure that. Okay. Thanks.
Yes, Andrea?
I guess I have a question about this level of complexity of the RFP. Is there a way to make it simpler? I've always found that when the instructions are complicated, the work product's going to be complicated. I'd like to see a simpler test, and the complexity of the RFP suggests that our test will actually end up being very complicated. Is there a way to simplify the RFP before it goes out? Does it have to have 14 different elements?
That's not something that's up to us. That's up to, I'm not sure exactly whose call that is, DOE, CECI, the state board, but that's the actual subject matter. That's the scope
Andrea,
of work.
I think I can kind of answer that. Andrea, it's the entire assessment system. It's not just ISTEP. So it includes all the assessment pieces that we use in the state of Indiana. We are putting them all out for an RFP. So it has several components that were already gone through the roundtable and this board, that those were the components that we wanted to see in our RFP.
What's the maximum number of vendors that could actually win a contract under this proposal?
Well, with 14 components.
It could
there
be 14.
Oh, yeah, we have several components, and yeah, don't.
Not to answer for
Brad?
Stan, but I think just to piggyback on Superintendent Ritz's response to your question, Ms. Neal, is thinking about, for example, component 1 is the 3 through 10 assessment. Again, these are all from the proposal that came from the roundtable, the resolution that you approved as a state board. Second one is I read 3, for example. The third component is phasing out ECAs. So they're each individual. What added some complexity was the formative assessment piece in K through 10. One of the things that the assessment subcommittee helped us know is that we probably should divide that into, break it down into some further grade level demarcations, maybe primary grades, and 310, let's say, and also maybe perhaps some vendors might want to bid only on English language arts or only on English and math. So that's why the DOA is actually dividing that up. But the components themselves actually are very similar in terms of what we're looking for with validity, reliability, and so on in each component.
Brad?
How comfortable are you? One of the things that the board members that served on the assessment subcommittee had quite a bit of conversation around was that timeline and that date. I guess my concern is given the potential for bid challenges and those having to be resolved and cleared out before we can award a bid, how comfortable are you on that March 2015 date? Does that factor in that possibility?
I'm very glad you brought that up. That's one other area I definitely wanted to cover. So for those that aren't aware, the Department of Administration does have a protest policy. That policy allows for businesses to protest and/or appeal the decision that we make. They have 5 business days after the date, after an RFP is awarded. So this date that's on here, this is when we award the vendor the ability to begin contract negotiations. So there's 2 things there I want to stress is 1, starting on the 16th, assuming we awarded on the 15th, the 16th would then begin the 5 business day protest period. During the protest period, contract signatures may not be obtained. Negotiations can take place, verbal conversations, but no contracts can be signed until that protest period is over. If we receive a protest, that protest and if there's an ensuing appeal have to be resolved prior to contracts being signed. That's something that's out of our control.
Does your office manage that, though? Will your office handle that?
Within IDOA, yes. There is a protest coordinator, and then the legal staff will also deal with resolving those protests and/or appeals. But that's important to note that is something that's a little bit out of our hand. We don't know.
Yeah, so we can't interpret this as though March 15, we're off and running, because there's a strong likelihood, because I've been through these over the years, and there's a strong likelihood there will be some kind of challenge. So we've got to work through that, and that's going to impact that timeline as well.
You are correct.
Okay,
You
so
are
make sure I was
correct.
right
The
on
other
that.
thing to factor in is that there is a contract negotiation period. We know at least one of the components last time, it was a rather lengthy process getting that contract negotiated, but we've also heard that there were some complexities there with the negotiations last time that likely won't be in place this time. So hopefully those negotiations will be faster. We've also discussed some creative ideas on how we will award this. As far as maybe doing, and we don't know yet for sure, but maybe doing some type of a rolling award where we award the components that are more complex or more important first and then trickle down to the others later. But I still think that, this would be a date for whatever that first component is, and you're right, we do have the protest period and the negotiation period.
David?
Assuming we have multiple vendors for each of these tests, what's the decision-making process? I'm not looking for the 50 steps, but briefly, who makes that decision? How does that happen?
at the agency's recommendation, if it's something that we want broken down into all those components, and we're gonna bid out all of those components separately, kind of going back to what I said earlier, it's almost as if we're doing 14 of these individual projects. Anytime we do an RFP, we have two main sectors, so to speak. One of those sectors is the evaluation team, who's evaluating the technical portion of the proposal, the meat and potatoes. We then also have the Indiana preferences section. So there isn't one person that dictates who's going to win each one of those. We take the scoring from the evaluation team, and then we take the scoring that we do in-house at IDOA, which is objective scoring. There's nothing subjective in nature about it. And we add those scoring together for every one of those components, and then that dictates who wins in each of those areas.
Is there a qualitative component such as the history of this particular vendor providing great service to another state, for example, or is it mostly quantitative?
Yeah, the first sector that I spoke to, one of those sectors, we have a business proposal section, and that's where we ask for information about the company itself and its history, who they've done business with, who they sub to, things like that. And then there's a technical portion all within that first sector where it's really asking about how do you do what you do? How will you accomplish what we want you to accomplish, and within the parameters that we set? And that all falls within that first sector that the evaluation team scores.
Thank you.
Can I ask the question on, you said when the RFP was posted, when is that date? I mean, when will the process start? I mean, it says day one. Is that already in place as of now, or we're waiting?
No, it has not been released, made
when
public.
would you anticipate that?
We would be hopeful for next Friday, the 15th. But again, that is a tentative and fluid date.
Any other questions?
Thank you for
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We appreciate working with you.
Very well.
We are going to recess for lunch. Let's resume here at 1:20. 1:20. Thank you very much.
What's that?
I was gonna say, it's only